This is the watercolor paper. One thing you'll notice about watercolor paper is that it's a lot thicker. It's almost like a cardstock. Watercolor paper is also way more expensive, so you want to make sure that you're not wasting it. When I give you your paper tomorrow, I am going to give you small pieces about like this because of that, because watercolor paper is so expensive. Now, you can do watercolor on thinner paper, but what ends up happening is the water will warp the paper. You can't pick up the watercolor as easily. So, for example, if I make a mistake and I want to lift it up a little bit, I'm going to show you how you can do that. You can't do that if you're not using watercolor paper. So you have to have very absorbent, thicker style paper. So the first thing you want to do is draw out a rough sketch of whatever object you are painting. So in our case, it's the apple. So I'm going to look at my actual apple I have sitting here as well as my image. Now, a key thing too when you're sketching this out, you don't want to make it really, really dark with your pencil. Why would you not want to make it super dark with your pencil?
Is it just a sketch?
It's just a sketch, right? And ultimately, you don't want these pencil lines to show up on your final product. So you want to make sure that it's light and that you can easily erase it and you won't be able to tell that there was ever pencil there. So I'm going to do this little mark right there. I'm going to do the stem. And I'm going to make this a little bit more flat. The back side there. That's the other good thing. If you do it lightly, you can correct mistakes, which is always what I have to do when I'm painting and drawing. All right, so we got the rough shape now of the apple, and something that's interesting about watercolors that's different from acrylics or oil paints is that it's very it goes on in layers, almost like a stained glass window. You know, stained glass is, anyways, if you layer it on top, it'll create, like, for example, if you layer a blue on top of a yellow, it will create a green. And the thing with watercolors is once you go really dark, you can't lighten it up as easily. So the best way to do watercolors is to start from the lightest color and work your way to the darkest color. On the other hand, when you do acrylics and oil paintings, you can start with the darker first and make your way to the lighter colors. So it's the opposite of what you would do with acrylic and oil. So that's just a key thing. And a lot of people are intimidated by doing like really fancy watercolor paintings because, because it's so easy to mess up. Whereas with oil and acrylic, you can pretty much cover up your mistakes. If you mess up, it's pretty easy to fix. So you can't see it over here, but I've got a cup of water and a paper towel, which you'll get all of those things tomorrow. So what I'm going to do first, because I'm thinking that sort of stained glass layering that I mentioned a second ago, before an apple turns red, what color is it? Green or yellow, depending on, the type. So what I'm going to do is pretend like I'm doing that underlayer first, and then I'm going to go over it with the red in certain areas. So I'm going to start out with like a kind of yellowish green. I've wet my brush pretty extensively, but I'm going to tap it a couple of times on my paper towel. I'm going to come over, let me get this so you can see my watercolor palette. So I'm going to go over to the yellow a few times and just a little bit of the green. I'm going to go over this whole apple. And it looks more brown actually on your screen. It's more yellow in person. Not sure why it's... So imagine you're building the apple from the layers underneath. And if you want to be really fancy, this is also called an underpainting. Like, for example, in oil and acrylic, they'll do an underpainting that that sets the tone for the whole feeling of the painting. So in a way, you're kind of doing that. So I'm going to let that dry for a second, clean off my paintbrush. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pick up some of the red, but I'm also going to do just a tiny bit of blue, just a tiny, tiny bit. So it's not entirely just bright red. So I'm going to put my paintbrush mostly in the red and then just a little bit in the blue. Now I've got a lot of pigment on my paintbrush, so in order to dilute it, you add more water. So watercolor is all about a mixture or balancing between the pigment, the paint, and the amount of water you have. So if you have more water on your paintbrush, will your colors be darker or lighter? What do you think? Lighter, actually. The more water, the more diluted the paint is. Whereas if you put more paint and less water, it will be darker. So once again, remember what I said, I'm kind of building the layers from underneath. I'm imagining all the places that kind of have this medium red. I'm going to go around and I'm going to leave that one area light where I want to have that reflection of the apple, imagining the lights hitting it there. I'm going to go back and add a little bit more. And now I'm going to come back with just more of the vivid red. Now that I've had those darker tones, I'm going to come back and layer more of the red on there. And I'm going to put, notice I have not gotten a lot of water either. I'm going to set that right there so you can see my cup of water. Because I want the colors to be more vivid. I'm going to do a little mark like right back there. I'm going to come back with a little bit of the blue as well. Now if you notice I put probably a little too much of that dark color back there. What you can do if your paint is still wet, you can take your paper towel and make a tip like that and dab the area where you went too dark and it'll lighten it up. So that's a way to save yourself if you feel like you went too dark in a certain area. Another thing you can do, so notice I'm going over that little spot that I said I was going to leave highlighted. If you clean off your brush completely, like get all the paint off of it, all the pigment, where there's just water left, and then take off some of that excess water on your paper towel, go over the area where you want to pick up the paint. So I'm going over this area here. So now it's really wet, and then come back with the dry paper towel. See how much that picked it up? So that's a technique you can do if you end up making an area too dark. But you have to work quickly. If you wait too long and let it dry, it's obviously you're not going to be able to pick it up. All right, I'm going to come back now with a little bit of red and a little bit of the purple, which is right down here, purple. And accentuate more of that shadow on this side. Now another thing I'm going to start doing, if you notice, if you ever look at apples, they kind of have streaks of color often that goes up. So I'm going to have some of those little lines work their way up. If your paintbrush is too wet, you won't be able to do that. So just be aware that in order to do those little lines going up, your paintbrush has to be a little bit on the dry side. I would call it like medium dryness. And one thing you can do, this helps to mark the shape of your apple as well. I'm going to go back over my highlight area and lift up some of that color so it's not super accentuated there. All right, I cleaned off my brush. I'm going to take a little bit more red and come around some of the areas and really make it look like a very happy apple, as I guess Bob Ross would say. I'm going to wet my brush again and do the rubbing through there just to make that not super harsh through there. So you can kind of blur your lines if you wet your brush. Just go in with a wet brush and no pigment. Now, one final thing I like to do is, apples are kind of earthy. So I do like to add just a little bit of brown here and there. So some little brown streaks. So what I've done is I've just put some brown on my paintbrush. You want medium dryness on your paintbrush here. I'm just going to go in and add a little bit more brown here and there. And I should not have cleaned off my brush. We still want to use that same brown to do the stem as well. So make sure your brush is not too wet. If your brush is too wet, your paint's gonna spread everywhere. So you want to keep it kind of a dry brush, as they would say. Have that come up. I'm gonna add a little bit of purple to that to darken it up. So often what artists do, if they want to create a shadow, they don't do black. So if you notice down here, I didn't use black to do a shadow. You use cool colors. What are the cool colors? Blue, purple, those are typically your cool colors. What are the warm colors? Yeah, red, orange, yellow. So if you want to do a highlight on something, you typically do it in like a yellow or warm color. And then if you want to do something that's supposed to be receding or going away from you, you do it in blue. So I'm going to go, brush is too dry. I'm going to go under here and create a shadow. All right. I've got it a little too wet down there. Need to my brush a little bit more dry. So if you make your brush too wet, it will, spread everywhere. So you want to make sure you have it just the right tone there. Now, if you notice, my apple, like this one has a darker shadow on this side, so I'm going to come back again with a pretty dry brush and put it in the purple and the blue again, and just do one more shadow line along this edge and along the bottom. And just spread it out so that it kind of bleeds into the rest of the, or fades into the rest of the apple. All right.